Katana, the soul of the samurai. The katana is the most iconic weapon in samurai culture and one of the most technically refined bladed weapons ever made by human hands. A master swordsmith would spend months forging a single blade, folding the steel repeatedly to remove impurities and create a weapon with a hard, razor-sharp edge and a flexible spine that absorbed impact without shattering. The result was a sword that could cut through flesh and bone with minimal resistance while surviving the stresses of combat. But the katana was more than a weapon. In samurai culture, it was considered the physical embodiment of the warrior's soul. A samurai never placed his katana on the ground. He never let another man touch it without permission. When a samurai died, his katana was buried with him or passed down as the most sacred family heirloom. The Japanese government today classifies antique katanas as national cultural treasures. There are blades in Japanese museums that are over 700 years old and still sharp enough to cut paper cleanly. The craft has never been surpassed. Wakizashi, the blade that never left the samurai's side. The wakizashi was the shorter companion blade to the katana, worn together in a pairing called daisho, which literally means big and small. If the katana was the weapon of the battlefield, the wakizashi was the weapon of everything else. It was worn indoors when the katana had to be left at the entrance. It was used in confined spaces where the longer blade was impractical. It was the weapon drawn for close-quarters combat, when the distance between two fighters collapsed to almost nothing. But its most significant cultural role was as the instrument of seppuku, the ritual suicide performed by samurai who had been dishonored or defeated. Death by one's own wakizashi was considered a dignified end, a final act of control over one's own fate. The blade that accompanied a samurai through life was also the one that ended it on his own terms. No other weapon in history carries that particular weight. Yumi. The yumi is one of the most distinctive bows ever made. It is asymmetric, with the grip positioned roughly 1/3 of the way up the bow rather than in the center, which allowed it to be used effectively on horseback without the lower limbs striking the horse. It was tall, often exceeding 2 meters, made from laminated bamboo and wood, and required years of dedicated training to draw properly. The art of Japanese archery, kyudo, is still practiced today as a discipline that is as much about mental state as physical technique. In feudal warfare, mounted archers were the elite of the samurai class. Battles often began with archery exchanges before the melee, and a skilled yumi archer could penetrate armor at distances beyond 100 meters. The asymmetric design that looked strange to Western eyes was a solution to a specific problem, arrived at through centuries of refinement. Form follows function, even when the form looks unusual. Yari, the spear that killed more samurai than any sword. The yari is the weapon that historical records suggest was responsible for the majority of battlefield deaths in feudal Japan, not the katana. The katana is the weapon of legend and ceremony. The yari was the weapon of practical warfare. A spear keeps the enemy at a distance, requires less individual training than swordsmanship to be effective in the hands of an infantry soldier. And in large-scale battles where hundreds of men fight in close formation, reach is everything. Yari blades came in many forms: straight, double-edged, cross-shaped, curved. The cross-shaped variant, the jumonji yari, was particularly brutal. Its horizontal blades could hook an opponent's weapon or limb, and the main blade could thrust simultaneously. Samurai trained extensively with the yari, and many considered it the primary battlefield weapon, reserving the katana for personal duels and close-quarters situations where the spear became unwieldy. Naginata. The naginata was a polearm, a long wooden shaft with a curved single-edged blade at the end, somewhere between a spear and a sword in its application. It gave a fighter the reach of a spear with the cutting capability of a sword. On the battlefield, it was used by samurai infantry, but its most fascinating cultural dimension is its association with women. The wives and daughters of samurai households were trained in naginata as their primary defensive weapon. If the castle was attacked and the men were absent or dead, the women fought. Historical records document numerous instances of samurai women defending their homes with naginata against armed attackers. Today, the naginata is the only traditional Japanese martial weapon whose primary practitioners are women. The major naginata competitions in Japan are dominated by female athletes. The weapon that was given to women as a tool of last resort became, over centuries, theirs entirely. Tetsubo. The tetsubo was a large club made entirely of iron or of heavy wood studded with iron projections, and it existed for one specific purpose: to destroy an opponent who was wearing armor. A blade can be deflected by armor. Blunt force cannot. A tetsubo strike against an armored samurai didn't need to pierce the steel. It transmitted the force directly through the metal and into the body beneath, shattering bones, rupturing organs, and rendering the armor itself a liability by trapping the damaged body inside it. The weapon required enormous physical strength to wield effectively, which meant it was associated with the largest and most powerful warriors. In Japanese folklore, it became the weapon of Oni, the demon figures of Japanese mythology, which gives some indication of the terror it inspired. A warrior who could swing a tetsubo effectively was not someone you wanted to fight in any circumstances. Kusarigama. The kusarigama was one of the most tactically unusual weapons in samurai culture. A sickle with a long chain attached to it, weighted at the end with an iron ball. It gave a fighter two completely different attack modes in a single weapon. The weighted chain could be swung to entangle an opponent's weapon, arms, or legs, immobilizing them or pulling them off balance, and then the sickle was used to finish the fight at close range. Alternatively, the chain could be used to keep an opponent at distance while looking for an opening. Fighting against it was deeply disorienting. There was no conventional counter because the weapon didn't follow conventional rules. Schools of kusarigama fighting, ryuha, developed their own complete martial systems around it. It was the weapon of ninja as much as samurai, favored precisely because its unpredictability was its greatest strength. An opponent who has never seen it before has no instinctive response to it. Tanto. The dagger that went everywhere. The tanto was the shortest bladed weapon in the samurai's arsenal, a dagger between 15 and 30 centimeters long, and it was the weapon of absolute last resort and closest range. Where the wakizashi was practical and the katana ceremonial, the tanto occupied a specific tactical niche. It could be concealed inside clothing, drawn in situations where no other weapon was accessible, and used in the kind of grappling, close-quarters combat where larger blades become impossible to maneuver. Samurai wore it tucked into their clothing rather than displayed at the belt. It was also the weapon traditionally used by samurai women for self-defense and suicide. Female members of samurai households carried a tanto and were trained in its use from childhood. The blade was small enough that its lethality depended entirely on the knowledge and intention of the person holding it. In the right hands, it was as final as anything on this list. Kanabo. The kanabo was the larger, two-handed version of the tetsubo, a weapon so heavy that historical accounts suggest only exceptionally powerful warriors could wield it in battle without exhausting themselves in the first exchange. It was essentially a long iron bar, sometimes spiked, designed to be swung with both hands to deliver crushing blows capable of destroying armor, breaking weapons, and killing horses. Killing the enemy's horse in mounted combat was a legitimate and devastating tactic. A samurai on foot was dramatically less mobile and more vulnerable than one mounted. A kanabo strike to a horse's legs or body could bring the animal down and the rider with it. The kanabo appears frequently in Japanese art and folklore as the weapon of supernatural beings and legendary warriors, which reflects its real battlefield reputation. It was a weapon that announced, simply by its presence, that the person carrying it was not someone who needed to be subtle. Shuriken, the throwing star, that was never just a toy. The shuriken is the most misrepresented weapon in samurai and ninja culture, reduced in popular imagination to a spinning star thrown at enemies in action films. The reality was more varied and more practical. Shuriken came in many forms: flat star-shaped blades, straight spikes called bow shuriken, and weighted darts. They were not primarily intended to kill. At the distances they were typically thrown, they lacked the mass to reliably penetrate deeply enough to cause fatal wounds. Their actual tactical purpose was disruption and distraction. Throwing a shuriken at an opponent forced them to react defensively, breaking their rhythm or focus for the fraction of a second needed to close distance or draw a primary weapon. They were also coated in poison in some documented cases, which changed the calculus entirely. A wound that barely breaks the skin becomes fatal hours later. The shuriken was not a killing blow. It was the setup for one. Odachi. The Odachi was a sword of extraordinary dimensions, with blades that could exceed 90 centimeters and overall lengths approaching 2 meters. It was so large that it could not be worn at the belt like a katana. It had to be carried over the shoulder or by an attendant walking beside the warrior. On the battlefield, it was used in open-field combat against mounted opponents. The length gave it the reach to strike a rider or horse from a distance that a standard sword couldn't cover. It was also used in the opening phase of large battles as an intimidation weapon. A samurai walking toward you carrying a blade nearly as tall as you are sends a message before a single blow is exchanged. The Odachi required exceptional strength and training to use effectively. which meant its wielders were elite among the elite. Its impracticality was also its statement. Carrying it said you were strong enough to use it and skilled enough not to need anything smaller. Explosive arrows. Fire and destruction from a distance. Feudal Japanese warfare was not limited to bladed weapons and individual combat. Siege warfare and large-scale battles required tools of mass destruction, and Japanese engineers developed specialized arrowheads for exactly that purpose. Incendiary arrowheads, packed with burning material, were used to set fire to wooden fortifications, supply stores, and buildings during sieges. More sophisticated versions contained small explosive charges derived from gunpowder, which detonated on impact, capable of killing multiple soldiers grouped together or destroying wooden defensive structures from a distance. The combination of the Yumi's range and power with an explosive or incendiary warhead created a standoff weapon that could devastate an enemy position before any hand-to-hand combat began. It is the feudal Japanese equivalent of artillery. Destroy from a distance, demoralize the enemy, then advance. The principle is as old as warfare itself. The Japanese application of it was, as with most things in their military tradition, refined to a precise and deliberate art.